So welcome to our interview series. This time we are in virtual room. As you might have recognized, the Rationale of minimum wage is published in the context of ICDD Working Papers series. We are very glad to have the author, Professor Dr. Hansjörg Herr. He is emeritus professor at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. He is expert in micro and macroeconomics, international economics, economic and monetary policies. It's very pleasure to have you, Hansjörg.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy that I can give this interview to you.
Thank you. Dear Professor Herr, we have read your research paper on the rationale of the minimum wage with a great interest. It's definitely worth noting that we are in the middle of minimum wage debate here in Germany. Social sciences in general and economics in particular are divided into two groups. Very broadly, one group is for a decent minimum wage, the other group is against the presence of minimum wage. You wrote this piece in the middle of this debate. Were you trying to influence this debate?
Yes, of course. I want to influence this debate, and I'm really recommending to increase the minimum wage, probably not only to 12 euro in the medium term. I think an even higher minimum wage would be justified in Germany.
Before getting into this debate, let me ask one question. In mainstream economics departments, including myself, from time to time, are still teaching students that wage level determined outside the market may cause unemployment and threaten macroeconomic stability. Your paper completely disagrees with these theses. Can you elaborate on your arguments?
Yeah, indeed, the mainstream economic approach argues that any minimum wage which is above the equilibrium wage will create unemployment. In my opinion, this model has many shortcomings. Let me just mention some of the shortcomings. The first one, it is a completely supply side determined model. That means it is excluded that companies lack demand. So demand never is a problem. It's only the supply side which determines employment. The second big shortcoming is that it is assumed that real wages are negotiated, but in reality, it's pretty clear that nominal wages are negotiated, and trade unions or whoever negotiates wages can only determine nominal wages. But this model assumes that real wages are negotiated. A third shortcoming is the whole model depends on the idea of decreasing marginal productivity. That means it is assumed that the more workers work in a company, the lower is the productivity of the workforce, and this is also very questionable. So overall, the model is not very convincing. But let me add one point. When we look at the minimum wage debate, the empirical facts show that minimum wage increases do not increase unemployment. So this model has a problem. The mainstream has found actually a very specific case, a so-called monopsony case. That means a demand monopoly, and applying this very specific case of a demand monopoly allows the mainstream to explain that under very specific situations, increases in minimum wages will not destroy jobs. Many mainstream economists use this special case to explain why minimum wage increases do not destroy jobs.
Thank you. I think mainstream economics pretty much also relies on perfect market competition. And current world economies are far from exhibiting perfect market competition and accomplishing long-term price stability and fair wage dispersion. What is special with the oligopoly markets when it comes to the wage market regulation?
First, let me support your argument that oligopolies or even monopolies become much more widespread when we look what happened the last decades. So we have more and more concentration of power. And of course, economists know that this power is used for rent seeking, for creating extra profits. And at least in my opinion, this tendency to have more oligopolies, monopolies, this tendency explains to a large extent why the wage share went down. And this has many other negative effects. For example, income distribution became much more unequal. Wealth distribution is very, very unequal. And this has problematic consequences. And at the same time, we see that trade unions became weaker and wage negotiations erode. And so when we take both together, that the wage bargaining power of trade unions decreases, and at the same time, we have an increase in oligopolistic and monopolistic market, then we have really a good understanding why wage dispersion, income inequality becomes much, much higher. And of course, minimum wages can play a role here. They can play a role here. Minimum wage policy can, in countries with very, very weak trade unions, minimum wage policy can support the power of workers.
But your paper is not driven by only moral values. In your working paper, basically, you are indicating that minimum wage has the potential to stabilize several imbalances in the capitalist economies. But there is one question that struck me. How do we know what the right wage level for a specific country? How do we know it?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. I have learned also by traveling to many countries and working for the Global Labor University, I've learned that minimum wages can have very, very different functions. So we have two extreme cases. In one extreme case, the minimum wage development substitutes wage bargaining. In that case, so to say, the wage round is very much determined by the development of minimum wages. And in that case, minimum wages should increase according to productivity plus a low inflation rate. That would be the ideal guideline. Of course, this cannot always be reached. There can be shocks and whatever. But let's say this kind of productivity-oriented development of wages is very, very important. And we can expect, if we don't have shocks, we can expect if minimum wages increase according to productivity, plus a target inflation rate, more or less a target inflation rate is realized. So this is one extreme case for minimum wages, but we find that in many developing countries with very weak trade unions, but also in, for example, in East European countries with weak trade unions, we find this kind of model that minimum wages really give a very strong signal for the wage bargaining round. The other extreme is that minimum wage increases compress the wage structure from below. And this is the case, for example, in Germany. This is the case in the United States. So in Germany, it is pretty clear if minimum wages increase, wage inequality is reduced because we have a compression of the wage structure from below. And here, of course, is the question, how high should minimum wages be? So this is a question of fairness, a question of what kind of wage dispersion a country would like to have. Yeah.
Well, let's directly come to the Germany, where our center is located. In Germany, the government is planning to implement circa 12 euro per hour minimum wage. And this is what I have heard, what I have read. Do you find this level appropriate, considering the arguments you present in the text? It should be more, it should be less.
Actually, in Germany, the minimum wage could be substantially higher, actually, and so in most countries, the minimum wage is between 40 and 60% of median wage. That median wage is the wage of the exactly the worker in the middle of the wage dispersion. So, and in Germany, this percentage is relatively low. I've even looked it up. In Eastern Germany, for example, we have reached a percentage of around 50%. In West Germany, only 40%. So the minimum wage is only 40% of the median wage. And this is, even in international comparison, relatively low. So that would give room to increase the minimum wage much faster and to a higher level. And we should keep in mind that Germany, even in the 1980s, was a country with a very small low wage sector. And then we had these reforms in the 1990s, and especially these Hartz IV reforms, and we have an explosion of a low wage sector. And minimum wage policy can help to reduce again this low wage sector, because it's for a country not positive to have a low wage sector. You later have low pension payments. It reduces productivity, this low wage sector, etc., etc. So it has many negative effects. And minimum wage policy could help to reduce this low wage sector, especially in the areas in which we find the low wages. Trade unions are very weak. So we really need a minimum wage policy to reduce the low wage sector. The last argument, which I feel also important, in Germany, the minimum wage is very close to the very basic social security transfer. So that means if you don't work, you get almost the same as when you go working for the minimum wage. And I feel there should be a certain difference, so if somebody is full-time working, that person should earn a little bit more than, let's say, what the very basic social transfer is. Yeah.
Thank you. What do you think? What is the role of trade unions, maybe universities, and other labor-friendly think tanks in advocating for minimum wage measures?
I think in universities, should support research about minimum wages. Universities should make should allow that there's an open debate, that we have different opinions. As you certainly know, in economics, we have different paradigms, as in social sciences in general. And we should not think that is negative, but we should take this as a chance to have an open debate, and then find the best solutions. So universities should push also heterodox debates, heterodox scholarships, etc., whatever is needed. And you also may know that especially in economics and macroeconomics, we have a almost complete dominance of mainstream economists, and this should be changed. Trade unions, of course, are extremely important also to debate minimum wages, and I think it was a great success by the German trade union movement that in 2015 minimum wages were introduced in Germany. So of course, trade union play a big role here. And let me add, the ideal system, in my opinion, is that the minimum wage is really setting the minimum, that the lowest wage, and trade unions at wage bargaining. So in the ideal case, minimum wage should not substitute wage bargaining, but should strengthen wage bargaining. And I hope we can keep this system in Germany, that we have the minimum wage, but in addition, we have strong wage bargaining systems. And actually, I would also very much like that we have more extension mechanisms, what the unions demand, that that companies which don't join employers associations also have to pay the negotiated wage. So that would be, in addition, an important government policy in addition to minimum wage policy.
Thank you. In this interview series, we always try to end each episode on a positive note. So, is there a person, organization, government, or a movement which currently inspires you and gives you hope? Perhaps there are some countries that are already implementing guarantees of minimum wage successfully, or reducing negative trends such as income inequality.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is a difficult question, because
the most difficult one, indeed.
Yeah, it's difficult, and actually, I don't find a country in which I think really good policy in the end is followed. But let me answer in the following way. The ecological transformation, which is now, nobody can avoid that, and also economic successes in countries like China has brought the government back. I think it's this high time of neoliberal thinking is over. It's a kind of new consensus that government should play a bigger role, that government has to intervene more in economic development. And I feel this debate gives a chance also to bring in progressive ideas into debate, and the possibility that we have a more regulated type of capitalism. I don't want to speak what will happen in very, very long run, but in my opinion, what should be achieved is a more regulated type of capitalism with more equality, also combining this with ecological transformation. And I think there's a certain chance that in several countries, a policy in this direction is possible.
Thank you. Well, hopefully next time where we can interview you in person, perhaps in Berlin or in Kassel. But it's always a pleasure to have you, Hansjörg.
Yeah, thank you for the give me the chance to give some ideas about minimum wages. So I'm very happy that I had this interview.